LGBT plus issues have become a huge battleground in terms of oppression and the struggle for liberation across the world. And I just want to start by saying congratulations to the organisers of Reclaim Pride in Manchester last weekend. I think that was an absolutely brilliant thing to do. It's really inspirational to see people take up the original spirit of Stonewall when organising prides. And that follows on from the London Reclaim Pride and London Trans Pride in June and July this year. And you can feel that there is a new mood around that really means that a radical LGBT plus movement can be built both in Britain and many countries internationally. And it's brilliant to hear what Agnieszka said about the opposition to the bigots organising those LGBT plus free zones in Poland. So really, you know, when it comes to what socialists say, I think we start with the idea that the issue of oppression and the fight for liberation is not a sidelined separate issue to the class struggle. It's a part of our fight to liberate the whole of humanity. The ruling class divide us in order to weaken our opposition and make us squabble amongst ourselves and attempt to make us blame each other instead of the root cause of the problems, which is capitalism. And sexual and gender oppression, far from being some natural feature of society, is a result of the way that the family is used under capitalism to reproduce the working class and set the norms for sexual behaviour and gender identity. This creates a distortion of what is deemed acceptable, allowable, and also creates a sense of what is deviant and other. And in that way, heteronormativity is used to other LGBT plus people. And I'm going to talk tonight really about two things in terms of class, really, which is what I've been asked to say. One in terms of the way that class society shapes oppression and creates oppression, but also the way that that society, that class society, is the source of a solution or a potential gravedigger in terms of getting rid of oppression. And, you know, kind of one of the things, you know, kind of I've felt over the last 20 years is that when you talk about LGBT plus oppression, not many people talk about class alongside it. And class is seen as something totally separate. And I've even heard the word classism as something that, kind of avoids the whole idea of there being any integration between oppression and class society. But early on, Marx and Engels recognized the importance of fighting against the oppression of different groups in the 19th century, alongside the fight against the exploitation of the working class, whether it was black workers in the USA, Irish migrant workers in Britain, and the position of women in the book, The Family, Private Property and the State, Engels's book from the 1840s. Engels explained how the family had come into existence before capitalism and how capitalism had changed the family to entrench women's oppression as the family bears the brunt of the cost for caring for present and past generations of workers and the rearing of the next. And Skye is absolutely right to say that the root of LGBT plus oppression is a similar root to that of women's oppression. And when you think about it, this fits into, it's brilliant, that Marx and Engels came up with these ideas about oppression. And when you think of modern words today like heteronormativity and the binary, you can actually think about that in some ways they meant these things when they were talking about the family. So the structures of class society shape and mold our attitudes to sexuality and gender. So heteronormativity is established as the status quo in order to encourage conformity. From day one, every child is bombarded about the way they are meant to behave and fit into sexual and gender roles that reflect the norms of the family. The idea of the binary is enforced in the same way, shaping our relationships, our desires, the expressions of who we are, and to mirror the idea of the family, which in turn shapes the categories by which people are judged by in wider society. And in order to achieve liberation, those structures have to be challenged. So for socialists, it's not just a question of changing ideas, but of transforming the material conditions under capitalism, which creates oppression. It's been exciting to see how the development of the struggle for trans and non-binary rights in the last 5 to 10 years has electrified the movement and created a radical vision of what a different kind of society might be like. And I think in the SWP, we welcome the questioning of putting people into rigid categories about gender and sexuality. We want to turn the struggle outwards and break down the barriers that oppress us. That is why we are 100% supportive of transgender and non-binary rights. What people's identities will be like under socialism after a revolution is anyone's guess, but we're starting to think about those things and question those things in the 21st century in a way that wasn't happening in the 20th century. And I think that's really important to realize. We know from pre-capitalist societies that the nuclear family is not the only way to organize society, and there are many other ways to live. I can't go into too much detail about that, but Engels argued about what it might be like in terms of saying that it might be limited to what will disappear. But when he talked about what will happen after a revolution, he said, when those people are in the world, they will care precious little about what anybody thinks they ought to do. They will make their own practice and their corresponding public opinion about the practice of each individual, and that will be the end of it. So really, we, the people, will decide who and what we want to be. So really, let's be clear. In order to achieve liberation, revolutionaries argue that the roots of oppression have to be torn up, and that means that capitalism itself has to be overthrown so that alternatives to the family and a new way of living can be developed. So where is this liberation going to come from? It's certainly not going to come from the Tories with their history of LGBT plus oppression from Section 28 through to Liz Truss's rejection of GRA reform and the problems that she has created for trans and non-binary people over the last few years. It's certainly not from Keir Starmer and the retreat from any radical position in the Labour Party since he became leader. So how do we connect a new radical LGBT plus movement with the masses of working class people? And this is where I think there is a big hole in the narrative of the LGBT plus movement. And that's what I want to try and give a little bit of an outline to here. I mean, when we look at LGBT rights in Britain today, well, there have been some advances in the last 20 years. We've seen the abolition of Section 28 in 2003 that silenced LGBT plus people in education for 15 years. We've seen civil partnerships in 2005, gay marriage in 2014. There's a greater visibility of LGBT plus issues and people in society, in the media and on TV. But I would argue that none of these things in some ways would have happened if there had not been a movement within the working class and in the trade union movement that fought for LGBT plus rights all the way through from the 80s into the 21st century. Anyone who's seen the film Pride about the connection between the lesbians and gays support the miners group and the South Wales miners during the general strike of 1984-85 can see that in that struggle, reactionary ideas can be challenged and rejected, and changes on a mass scale take place in a way that could not happen otherwise. In 1985, the miners from South Wales led that year's London Pride March. It was unthinkable that such a thing would happen. But I also think that the repercussions of that and the connections that were made between those relationships in struggle, those connections between LGBT plus support groups and unions had huge repercussions. These connections influenced the Labour Party to adopt positive policies towards LGBT plus people, on the age of consent, on LGBT plus rights, on same-sex adoption policies. Since the mid-80s onwards, every trade union now has an LGBT plus representation and policy. And of course, trade unions are mass organisations, which alongside other labour movement organisations have a huge reach to millions of working class people. And just to put it into context, I want you to think, you know, kind of back in 1983, there's a thing comes out every year, which is called the annual British Social Attitudes. In 1983, 50% of people saw homosexuality as always wrong, with only 17% thinking it was, quote, not wrong. This figure of not wrong fell to 11% during the panic about AIDS in 1987. It was the 1980s was a hugely, reactionary period. Unions were at the forefront of moving to a positive public acceptance of LGBT plus rights and were way ahead of the curve of public opinion. By 2016, there was a 16% approval rate for gay marriage. You have to think, how did that happen? And I think that unions played a huge role in doing that. That is largely not reflected in the narrative that is spun. And I think it's really important that we hold that up as a really important way that those things changed. I mean, those changes were too late in order to develop a fully concerted campaign to stop Section 28, but they were key in forcing Blair's Labour government to abolish Section 28 in 2003. This is important today when we think about how we develop the movement that we have into a mass radical one, especially in terms of trans and non-binary rights. At London Trans Pride this year in June, I helped manage to organise my union's intervention, and we managed to get 12 out of the 32 London boroughs, NEU banners, union banners, onto the march. It had a brilliant effect. People were coming up to us and saying, "Who are you? Why are you here? What's this all about?" And, you know, it really was brilliant to see, kind of labour organisations, union organisations taking a leading role on a demonstration for trans rights and non-binary rights. It also meant that lots of NEU members came on the march to represent their areas. There were over 10,000 on the demonstration, and it was a huge step forward from what we have done before. It made a huge difference in terms of trans non-binary people feeling supported, but also it was incredibly impressive to see that march through the streets of London into Soho. Within the NEU, trans and non-binary rights have been at the centre of the union's concerns for the last 5 years. And during that time, we have won support for GRA reform, support for a union definition of transphobia, and the development of trans and non-binary inclusive educational strategies in schools. I've also helped develop an LGBT plus charter for schools, which is going to be implemented over the next year nationally at some point. It's so important that we have strong unions in education, where 60% of trans students are bullied, which of course is the tip of the iceberg, because so many wouldn't even get to the stage of maybe even saying anything or even saying that they were being bullied, and where homophobic bullying is still widely prevalent. So, you know, also in the NU, one of the things that we've done is that we've marginalised some of the leading members of the union who have been publicly supporting Women's Place UK. We've put the argument that the struggle against transphobia and the struggle against women's oppression is entirely compatible and not in conflict in any way. Because we've argued this in the most positive way, we've actually made it into a kind of common sense argument in the union, and have won over a lot of the people who are in the middle ground in a way, and pulled them away from the reactionaries, the transphobes, and we pulled them into a position that is supportive. And these arguments are bound to reoccur, but we are in a good position to win them over. Of course, we're talking about a period when class struggle has been very low, really, over the last 20 years. But we can win reforms even when the struggle is low. When the class struggle is high, though, there is a greater chance of liberation. And I think the biggest hole in the narrative of LGBT plus history is the achievement of the Russian Revolution. It hardly gets mentioned when people talk about this, but 50 years before homosexuality was decriminalised in Britain, it was actually won in a country that was very underdeveloped, very backwards compared to Britain in terms of its development, and yet that happened through a revolution. And I think that is something we should actually really celebrate. It gave a tragically short glimpse of how society could be organized to give people control over their lives from the workplace to their most intimate relationships. And revolution made a difference that was absolutely positive. We need to take that as our inspiration for what is possible when we think of creating a different society. The battle for LGBT plus liberation is clearly far from over, and it is important that we link the fight against oppression with the fight to get rid of capitalism, because it's only then that we can dig up the roots of our oppression and create a world where people are free to shape their own sexualities and identities. There is a world to win. There are two images that I think about over the last few years that come into my mind when I think about this in terms of, internationally. Last year during the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, so many people raised the Black Trans Lives slogans during that point on placards and in their chants in the US and Britain. And that shows the potential for fighting against oppression, but linking it to struggle and trying to change the world. Those things come up automatically when struggle starts to be raised. And the second image that comes into my mind is that in every struggle against every ruling class in the world, I see a rainbow flag on every demonstration. And that shows how that has become part of the international struggle, and it shows the potential for a united fight against the system. We have to link those struggles to the power of the working class in order to end the system that oppresses us once and for all. Thanks.